My name is Sabby Sagall. I'm a long-standing pro-Palestinian activist. I'm the chair of the Camden in London, the Camden Palestine Solidarity Campaign. So I'll speak for about half an hour, then we will be open to questions and contributions. Well, as Alex has just mentioned, last December and January, a wave of revulsion swept across the world as we watched the Israeli Air Force and Army mount a vicious, brutal assault on a virtually defenseless Palestinian population of Gaza. We watched in horror as we saw phosphorus bombs raining down on civilian homes, on hospitals, schools and libraries, on a people who were living in what has been described, as Alex indicated, as the largest open-air prison in the world. Now, Israeli apologists claim that Israel was merely acting in legitimate self-defense against Hamas's rockets, which it was launching against Israeli civilian targets. The Hamas government, Hamas, people probably know, means Islamic Resistance Movement. They had been elected to a majority government in January 2006. I'll come back to that. Now, Israel also said they couldn't understand why Hamas was attacking Israeli civilian targets, given that Israel had withdrawn its military bases and its settlers, some 8,000 settlers in the Gaza Strip in the summer of 2005. The reality, of course, is quite different. Israel may have removed the military bases and withdrawn its settlers from Gaza, but in reality it continued to control every aspect of life in Gaza through the imposition of a very tight military cordon that controlled everything that went in and everything that came out of Gaza. Moreover, in the other occupied territory, the West Bank, some 700 Israeli army checkpoints continued to control every aspect of Palestinian life, continued to throttle the Palestinian economy. And Israeli settlers continued to expand the settlements. There were now some, by then there were some, nearly 400,000 or more Israeli illegal settlers in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. They were continuing to steal Palestinian land and prevent Palestinians from gaining access to their farms, preventing Palestinian students reaching their schools and colleges, preventing Palestinian patients from reaching hospitals. So controlling and undermining every aspect of Palestinian life. Also, Israel had built this apartheid wall from 700 kilometers, again making the West Bank a large open-air prison. And Palestinian villages continued to be surrounded and hemmed in by illegal Israeli settlements and military bases. So it's really not hard to understand why Hamas won the Palestinian legislative elections in January 2006. The Western governments and Western apologists reacted with horror. They seemed to be stunned by the news of Hamas's victory in January 2006. Anyone who knew anything about Palestine, or who regularly visited Palestine, as I was doing, wasn't at all surprised by Hamas's victory. It was absolutely clear that they were going to win the elections. That victory, the legislative victory, was heavily trailed by Hamas's victory in municipal elections at the end of 2004 and the beginning of 2005. So really, it wasn't a surprise, and quite clearly what Israel was doing with its brutal assault on Gaza last December and January was not so much defending its citizens against attack, but clearly punishing the Palestinian people for having exercised their democratic right and having voted in a Hamas government. Why did they vote for Hamas? I think there are three main reasons. First of all, Hamas had shown itself, the leadership of Hamas had shown itself to be incorruptible, contrary to the Fatah leadership that had dominated the Palestinian national resistance for so long. I'll come back to that later. So the Hamas leaders were seen by the majority of Palestinians to be incorruptible. Secondly, they were mounting a determined leadership against Israeli occupation, again contrary to what Yasser Arafat and his colleagues had been doing as leaders of Fatah in the course of the so-called peace process through the decade of the 1990s and early in the 21st century, early 2000 and the early period of that decade. Thirdly, Hamas had organized a vast array of social welfare services. They were organizing schools and hospitals. They were helping to rebuild houses that the Israeli army had destroyed as part of its collective punishment policy. So it wasn't really a surprise that Hamas won the election. But Israel and the United States, followed by the European Union, responded to Hamas's victory by imposing sanctions, by refusing to deal with Hamas, refusing to have anything to do with Hamas, withholding tax receipts that were legitimately theirs, and so on. And they imposed 3 conditions. Israel and the United States, backed by the European Union, including our own government, imposed 3 conditions for the lifting of sanctions on the Hamas government. They said that Hamas must recognize the state of Israel. Hamas must refuse to cease to deny Israel's right to exist. Hamas must recognize past agreements signed between Israel and the Fatah administration under the late Yasser Arafat. And thirdly, Hamas must renounce the pursuit of violence to achieve their aims. Now, if we look at those 3 conditions, they're a bit bizarre, actually. Demanding that Hamas recognize Israel might make some sense if Israel had shown respect for the Palestinian right to national self-determination. But Israel had shown no such respect for the Palestinian right to national self-determination. On the contrary, I mean, if you look at the peace process from 1993 onwards, the peace process that was ushered in by the Oslo negotiations of 1993. People may remember the famous handshake between Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Rabin on the lawn of the White House, with then President Clinton in the middle. That really looks a bit bizarre now in the light of what happened subsequently. But throughout the peace process, the subtext of the peace process was meant to be Israel's acceptance of a Palestinian state in the 1967 borders, within the 1967 borders. In other words, Israel would vacate the territories it had conquered in the 1967 war, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and recognize the setting up, allow a Palestinian state to be set up in those areas bordered by the 1967 frontier. The borders that existed before Israel invaded and occupied those territories. But Israel, in the course of the peace process, consistently sabotaged any possibility of the Palestinians being able to set up their own state. In the famous Camp David talks in the summer of 2000, again hosted by the then President Bill Clinton, what Israel is supposed to make a generous offer to the Palestinians. In reality, if you look at the small print, what Israel was offering to Yasser Arafat, then leader of the Palestinians, was a few cantonized areas, a few territorial blocks in the West Bank, surrounded by illegal Israeli settlements and military bases. The Palestinians were being offered a few cantonized areas very reminiscent of Native American reservations in the United States. And in the light of that flagrant Israeli undermining of any possibility of a Palestinian state being created, why should Hamas recognize Israel's right to exist? Why should Hamas give up their main bargaining counter? So that was really a very unrealistic demand. Indeed, the notion that Hamas should in advance give up violence seems a bit out of touch with reality in the light of Israel's extreme violence towards the Palestinian people since the outbreak of the Second Intifada in September 2000. Between the year 2000 and 2006, Israel killed some 4,000 Palestinians, most of them civilians. Though some degree